Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Now, when Geoff Huggins said yesterday in his introductory speech that he was surprised to talk to so many people, he was certainly not the only one. I'm really impressed and also grateful that I have the opportunity to be invited at this important conference and to talk a little bit about the Council of Europe's work on the promotion of the human rights of older persons. Now, there's certainly a distinction we need to make here between older persons as a group and persons suffering from dementia. Even though dementia strikes mainly, though not exclusively, those over the age of 60, and the risk of developing the disease, as you all know, rises with age, there is a significant overlap between the two groups, which I think justifies to make a general presentation of the human rights of older persons. To start with, for those not familiar with the very complex architecture of European institutions, the Council of Europe is a separate organization from the European Union. While our mandate, which is the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, is more specific than that of the EU, our geographic reach is a wider one. Amongst the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, there are of course, the 28 member states of the EU, but also 19 other states which are not in the EU. For example, Turkey, Switzerland, Norway, Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, or Azerbaijan. And it covers a geographic area of 800 million citizens from Lisbon to Vladivostok, most of them living in society which face a demographic change previously unknown. And the most well-known treaty with which I want to start of the Council of Europe is, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is applied and interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which is still, as to date, the only international human rights court which can be directly addressed by individuals with applications against member states, and that has the possibility to give binding judgments if there was a human rights violations, of course only after the remedies available at the domestic level before the national courts have been exhausted. And the European Convention was negotiated many decades ago when Europe didn't have such a demographic problem as it has today, so it doesn't make a specific reference to age, but that of course doesn't mean that the convention doesn't apply to older persons. Quite the contrary, you find more and more cases by the European Court that concerns age, and I will give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. To start with two cases concerning persons suffering from dementia. There was a case, Dodo versus Bulgaria, which was decided in 2008, where a person suffering from Alzheimer vanished from a state-run nursing home despite instructions to never leave her unattended, and she disappeared and was never to be found. And in that case, which was brought by the relatives of that person, the European Court of Human Rights decided that the Bulgarian authorities had failed to protect that person's life, to adequately supervise her, but also they had failed to launch a proper and effective procedural investigation afterwards to establish the fact and to find out what had happened. On top of that, the relatives fought before the national courts for more than 10 years, and the European Court of Human Rights considered this also a violation of their right to a fair and speedy trial. Now, this also stresses the importance of judicial guarantees. And in another case, X and Y versus Croatia, that importance is being illustrated. In that case, which concerned the right to fair proceedings by a 70-year-old woman suffering from dementia, the applicant had been 2 years after a guardian was appointed for her, had been divested of her legal capacity. And she alleged that these proceedings had been unfair as she had not been notified and she had not been heard by a judge and wasn't able to give evidence. And in its judgment, the court found that the applicant had indeed been deprived of adequate procedural safeguards, and it also observed, and I think this goes nicely with what my colleague Mr. McKay just said about the Scottish system, that in order to ensure proper care for the ill and the elderly, the state authorities had at their disposal much less intrusive measures than divesting that person of legal capacity. And then this April, in a case against the United Kingdom, the case was called Macdonald versus the United Kingdom, the court considered an application concerning a decision by the local authorities to reduce the care allowance for a 70-year-old woman with severe limited mobility. And even though it did not find a violation in that case, the court said importantly that the right to private life under Article 8 of the Convention applied with regard to the provision of services to a disabled or older person. And in doing so, the court focused on the applicant's human dignity and took into account the provisions of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So that case might have well opened the door for subsequent cases which might turn out to be more successful. The fourth case I would like to mention is a case brought against Germany, Heinisch versus Germany, which concerned the abuse of older person in institutional care, which, if we believe the facts of the World Health Organization with regard to Europe in a report issued a few years ago, is a structural and a massive problem. And in that case, a whistleblower who worked in a nursery home reported about abuses in that institution and was dismissed. And the court found that this had been a violation of the right of freedom to expression under Article 10 of the Convention. And it stressed that in particular, in aging societies where there's a particular vulnerability of the patients concerned who often may not be in the position themselves to report this abuse, it was very important that staff in a nursery home, after having observed certain criteria, for example, to first internally discuss the problems, to not sanction the fact that they make these reports public. Now, there are a lot more cases with regard to older persons under the European Convention on Human Rights. For example, a lot of cases concerning euthanasia and assisted suicide, compulsory confinement in nursery homes. I think we also heard about that in the context of the Scottish legal system. And then, of course, rights of older prisoners, which should also be mentioned here. As our societies age, so does the prison population, and I think it can be safely assumed that dementia doesn't stop at the prison gates. I cannot go into detail here, unfortunately, about these cases, but if you're interested, the European Court of Human Rights has, a couple of months ago, on account of the fact that more and more cases arrived concerning older persons, made a thematic fact sheet and published it on his website. It is available there, and you can get a lot of background information also on the cases that I have already mentioned. Then I would like to continue with another Council of Europe treaty, which is the European Social Charter, which protects more economic and social rights. And it has a specific provisions, one of the very few specific provisions for older persons under international law, which is Article 23 of the revised European Social Charter, which gives older persons the right to social protection. And the European Committee of Social Rights, which is the body that supervises the implementation of this treaty, mostly on account of state reports that are being submitted, found this January that there was certainly room for improvements in this regard in Europe. Out of the 20 states it considered, it found that 14 were in breach of this provision, mostly because of inadequate resources for older persons, also lack of non-discrimination legislation, but it also considered that abuse of older persons was a serious and hidden problem and asked all states to report in the future on what measures they have taken in this respect. And then also with regard to dementia, I think it is important to note that the committee also asked states for information on the legal frameworks related to assisted decision-making for older persons, and in particular, whether there are safeguards in place to prevent the arbitrary deprivation of autonomous decision-making by them. Apart from these two treaties that I mentioned, there are quite a few soft law, non-binding standards by the Council of Europe. I would like to mention one which is a relatively new one, and I had the honor to be a little bit involved in the negotiation of this place. And it's a new recommendation by the Committee of Ministers, which is the body in the Council of Europe in which all 47 governments are represented. And they have adopted a new recommendation on the promotion of human rights of older persons this February. And this is a text that was negotiated over the course of 1.5 years by 12 experts, together with a big group of observers, which comprised the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the European Union, a lot of national human rights institutions, and also non-governmental organizations, notably the Age Platform Europe, and the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities addressed our group in order to underline some of the aspects of the UN Convention, which were important also with regard to older persons. And this recommendation consists of a set of 54 principles, which is regrouped in 7 chapters to promote, protect, and ensure the full implementation and enjoyment of human rights by older persons, and to also promote respect for their inherent dignity. And the chapters are divided notably into general principles, non-discrimination issues, autonomy and participation, protection from violence and abuse, social protection and employment, care, which includes medical care, residential and institutional care, as well as palliative care, and then finally judicial guarantees. And each chapter comes together with a guide of good practices from the national practices of our member states, which illustrates possibilities and gives some good ideas for the implementation of the principles. And just to give you one example, the Dementia Strategy that Denmark developed in 2010 is being mentioned, which makes specific recommendations to strengthen the services for persons suffering from dementia and to also allocate funds to family members. Now, given the very limited time, I will briefly only focus on, I think, the 2 chapters that are of most relevance in our context today. One is the chapter on autonomy and participation in decision-making. The main idea, of course, in that chapter is to recognize older persons' right to self-determination and their legal capacity to decide in their best interest about their person and their affairs. And this part also covers situations where older persons may not be able to exercise their legal capacity and intends to ensure help for them, and also to establish criteria to prevent abuses and to make sure that this is in line with the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, but also with other international standards such as the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then the other chapter that is of particular interest here is the chapter on care, which has been designed with a view to ensuring appropriate and affordable health and long-term quality care for older persons at home or in specific institutions. Specific provisions deal with consent to medical care and to placement in institutions, and with situations when older persons may not be able to express consent any longer. With regard to medical care, the recommendation is primarily based on another Council of Europe treaty, which is the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Dignity of the Human Being with regard to the application of biology and medicine. This is a very long name, but also a very important convention in this regard that really sets out the legal requirements in this field. And then the chapter also addresses palliative care, as necessary care, providing an appropriate environment for older persons to cope with pain towards the end of their life situations. Now, in conclusion, let me say something about the expected impact of this recommendation. As I already said, it is a non-binding instrument, but that doesn't mean that it's toothless for several reasons. First of all, the recommendation does not limit itself to simply replicate the already existing standards at the Council of Europe level, such as the case law of the European Court of Human Rights or what I've just mentioned as protection under the European Social Charter, but rather it tailors them to the specific circumstances and needs of older persons and tries to fill gaps in the implementation of these standards and present them as a common position by all 47 member states of the Council of Europe. And I think this is quite an important aspect. And we have seen that with previous recommendations on human rights of other groups. For example, just to give you an appropriate example, a few years ago, the Committee of Ministers made a recommendation on the human rights of members of the armed forces. And 2 weeks ago, the European Court of Human Rights issued a groundbreaking judgment in this field, and it quoted extensively this recommendation by the Committee of Ministers, pointing out that this was already a common position in all 47 member states. And then lastly, there will be a follow-up process to this recommendation, which will happen after 5 years, which will be then in 2019, in which member states will be asked most probably in a questionnaire to report on what measures they have taken to implement this recommendation. And there will be a possibility, most likely, for the non-governmental sector and civil society to participate in this process, and also to encourage governments to actively participate in this follow-up process. And I suppose that Alzheimer Europe could have a big interest to actually actively participate in this. And also, of course, the dissemination of this recommendation is very important to us. The more people know about it, the more it can actually work and change the situations of older persons. And I'm actually most grateful for the opportunity that I was given to be here today and to present this recommendation to so many people. Now, to conclude, this was a very legal presentation, and I apologize to those who are not too familiar with the technical language of lawyers. Therefore, I would like to conclude on a bit of a more personal level. Even though I'm not an expert on dementia, and I know that many of you in the room here are, I would like to state that I have come across one of the many books written about this subject, which has moved me probably more than any other books has moved me in years. And the Austrian author called Arno Geiger has written about his experience with his father suffering from the disease in the book, The Old King in His Exile. And I understand the book has been translated into English and therefore is also available to an international audience. I'm sure some of you are aware of that book, but otherwise it can deeply recommend it, because it's not so much a book about Alzheimer, but rather about a father-son relationship. And I find it outstanding because it focuses on the safety net that family, friends, and carers can provide for a person suffering from dementia. And that this is eventually the essence of everything, is something that should not be forgotten and should not be lost, even when you approach the topic, as I have today, from a more legal perspective. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthias. We have time for one question. There's a question there.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Peter Gordon. I'm a psychiatrist for older adults in Scotland. And it was just, given that you were talking for the Council of Europe and rights for older people, and you also talked about the self-determination for dementia. I guess one of my concerns at the moment is about screening, and whether we're giving, and we're talking about screening for older adults mostly, and whether we're giving the opportunity for our older adults to have informed choice of that screening, you know, fairly brief screening skills in terms of both the benefits and the harms. Obviously the benefits in terms of detecting a potential diagnosis of dementia, but also the harms, I think, of screening most of our older adult population in terms of false positives, false negatives, fear, reductionisms, etc. So I'm sorry, it's a complicated question, but it's really a question applying to all older adults, and whether we should be looking at screening in terms of what the World Health Organization defined back in 1968, where they had 10 criteria to make sure that there's protections for both the benefits and the harms. I'm not entirely convinced at the moment, certainly in Scotland, that we're going about screening with having fully thought through the ethics.
Thank you very much. I suppose the issue of screening does raise interesting legal questions also from a human rights point of view. Consent would certainly be an issue that has to be addressed. It's a very complex question, and it would be, we probably wouldn't have time to go too much into detail about this, but this Council of Europe Convention on Biomedicine that I mentioned earlier is, for example, an international treaty that regulates states' obligations with regard to medical consent, which I think screening would certainly fall underneath it. So it is absolutely a legal problem of the future. I would agree with you.